There are things buried in the back 40 of our family's land that my brother and I were never supposed to find. And the day we did was the same day the people who threw us out at 16 learned what it really meant to underestimate two boys raised by a quiet man who knew exactly what he was leaving behind. My name is Wesley Kincaid. My brother's name is Asher. And the workshop our grandfather built with his own hands, the one our stepmother sealed shut 3 days after his funeral and forbade us from entering, held something inside it that didn't just change our lives. It rewrote every single line of paper our family had been signing for the last 40 years. It exposed a forgery that had been hiding in plain sight in the Greene County deed office. And it returned to us what was always supposed to be ours, what our grandfather had quietly protected for two boys he loved more than anyone ever realized. This is the story of how a sealed workshop, a brass key sewn into the lining of an old work coat, and a man who never raised his voice in his life, finally spoke loud enough to be heard from the grave. Before I take you any further, do me a small kindness. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. The stories we tell here are about people who got pushed down and stayed standing anyway. And the more of you who join us, the more of those stories we can find and tell. So go ahead, subscribe, drop your town in the comments, and settle in. This one runs long, but I promise you, every minute of it earned its place. To understand what happened to Asher and me, you have to first understand what kind of man our grandfather was, because everything that followed was shaped by him long before we were old enough to know it. Our grandfather's name was Hollis Kincaid, and he farmed 240 acres of rolling, stubborn ground on the eastern edge of Greene County, in a part of the country where the soil is heavy red clay in some places and rich black bottomland in others. And you don't argue with either one. You just learn what each kind needs and you give it. Hollis had farmed that land since he came back from Korea in 1955. His own father had handed him a worn-out tractor and a deed and said, "This is yours now, son. Do better with it than I did." And Hollis did. He paid the taxes every year for 61 years without once being late. He ran cattle on the back pasture, soybeans on the bottoms, and corn on the high ground. He kept a small stand of hardwood timber along the creek that he refused to ever cut, even in the lean years, because he said his daddy had let too many trees go and he wasn't going to be that kind of man. He built a workshop behind the main house in 1968. The year my father was born, a long, narrow, tin-roofed building with a poured concrete floor, he laid himself one Saturday in August with 3 neighbors and a case of cold soda. The workshop had a heavy oak door double thick, with a single brass deadbolt he installed personally. Inside, he kept his tools, his welder, his lathe, his press, and the long workbench where he repaired everything from tractor manifolds to the broken hinges on a neighbor's gate. But he kept other things in there too. A locked metal cabinet in the back, behind a tarp, a roll-top desk with a drawer that didn't have a handle on it because he'd taken the handle off himself, and a floor safe set into the concrete in the corner that he never once opened in front of anyone. Not me, not my brother, not even his own son. That workshop was Hollis's place. The kitchen was Grandma Eulalie's. The house was the family's, but the workshop was his. And when Asher and I were small, I'm 3 years older than my brother, so I remember more of it. We used to spend whole summer afternoons out there with him, sitting on overturned 5-gallon buckets, watching him work. He didn't talk much. Most of what he taught us, he taught with his hands. How to true a wheel, how to read a weld, how to listen to an engine, and tell from 100 feet away whether the timing was off. But every now and then, in the quiet that came over the shop when the radio was off and the heat of the day had settled, he would say something that didn't quite make sense at the time, but lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind anyway. He'd say, "The land remembers everything. Boys, don't you forget that." Or, "Paper can lie, but a man's work doesn't." Or, "The most important thing in this whole shop is the thing you walk right past and never see." I didn't know what he meant. Asher didn't either. We were boys. We thought he was just talking the way old men talk. We didn't understand, not yet, that everything Hollis Kincaid said in that workshop was a clue he was leaving for us to find later, when we needed it. Our mother died when I was 9 and Asher was 6. Cancer, the fast kind, the kind that comes in like a thunderstorm and is gone in 4 months. Our father, Hollis's only son, a man named Garrett who had inherited his father's quiet but none of his patience, fell apart for a year. He drank. He missed work. He stopped coming out to the farm. And then one day he met a woman named Loreen at a bar in the next county over. And within 14 months, he had married her, moved her into our house, and started telling Asher and me that we needed to call her mom and that moms would make things normal again. Loreen never made anything normal. She was a sharp-edged woman, tall, with hair dyed the color of dark cherry wood, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she'd already decided something about you and you'd been graded and found wanting. She had 2 children of her own from a previous marriage, Brent, who was 12 when she moved in, and a daughter, Caitlin, who was 7. And from the first day, it was clear who counted in that house and who didn't. Brent got the bigger bedroom. Caitlin got new clothes. Asher and I got the message, repeated in 1,000 small ways, that we were the leftovers from the previous arrangement, and that the new family was going to be built around her children, not us. The one place we could go where none of that mattered was a farm. Grandpa Hollis's place was 20 minutes down the county road, and Asher and I rode our bikes out there nearly every weekend, every summer day. Every afternoon, we could get away. Hollis put us to work, baling hay, mucking the barn, fixing fence, and he paid us in cash, and in something more important than cash, which was the experience of being treated like we mattered. He'd sit us down at the kitchen table, and Grandma Eulalie would feed us cornbread and beans, and Hollis would ask us what we were learning in school, and he would actually listen to the answer. He never once compared us to Brent or Caitlin. He never once made us feel like we were a problem. He just acted like we were exactly the boys he'd hoped his son would have, and like the farm was as much ours as anyone's. Grandma Eulalie died when I was 13. After that, Hollis got quieter. He spent more time in the workshop. He started keeping a notebook in his coat pocket, a small green ledger, leather-bound, the kind they sell at farm supply stores, and he wrote in it most evenings at the kitchen table. He never told us what he was writing. We never asked. But once, when I was 15, he caught me looking at it, and he said, "This is for later, Wes. This is a long story of what's true." And I nodded like I understood, even though I didn't. There are things, looking back, that I should have understood at the time, but did not. Hollis spent the last year of his life teaching us in a way that was deliberate, even if it didn't feel deliberate. He had me out at the corner of the back 41 afternoon when I was 15, walking a fence line that didn't really need walking, and he stopped at a particular cedar post and put his hand on it and said, "This is the corner, Wesley, the legal corner. Section line runs north from this post. You ever need to know exactly where this place ends? This is where it ends." I thought he was just being thorough. He was teaching me how to find my own boundary line in case I ever had to defend it. He took Asher into the workshop one Saturday and walked him through every machine in the place, and he made my brother repeat back the year. He had bought each one, and where each one was made, like a child reciting the multiplication tables. He took us, separately, on different weekends, into the small office off the kitchen of the main house, and he showed us how he kept the books, the column for income, the column for expenses, the column for taxes paid, and he made us watch him reconcile the numbers slowly with a number 2 pencil, the way his own father had taught him. He was preparing us. He was preparing us without telling us we were being prepared, because, I have come to understand, he did not want us to grow up looking forward to a thing. He wanted us to grow up earning a thing. There is a difference, and Hollis was a man who knew the difference and respected it. Hollis died in early March of the year I turned 16. Asher had just turned 13. Grandpa had been losing weight for months, a slow, steady loss that he refused to explain to anyone, and that he never went to the doctor about, because he was a man of his generation and his upbringing, and he believed, in the way men of that generation believed, that going to the doctor was for things that could not be ignored, and that everything else could be. We all knew it was coming. Knowing doesn't help much when it actually arrives. He died at home in his own bed, the way he always said he wanted to, with the morning light coming in through the east window and the sound of mourning doves out in the bottom field. Aunt Marlene had driven down from her place 3 counties over the day before, having been called by Grandma Eulalie's old friend Inez, who had stopped by and seen Hollis and known. Aunt Marlene was sitting in the chair by his bed when he went. The funeral was 3 days later, on a Tuesday, at the Little Methodist Church on Route 9, where Hollis had been a member since 1958. The whole county came. Half of them brought food. The line of trucks at the cemetery stretched a quarter-mile down the gravel road, and the men who had farmed alongside Hollis for 40 years stood with their caps in their hands while the dirt went in. 3 days after that, our stepmother changed the locks on the workshop. Loreen had not been close to Hollis. He had tolerated her, the way decent people tolerate the spouse of someone they love but don't agree with, but he had never warmed to her, and she had never forgiven him for that. She had spent 15 years being the wife of Hollis, Kincaid's son, without ever feeling like she was a real Kincaid, and the moment Hollis was in the ground, something in her changed. Or maybe nothing changed. Maybe she just stopped pretending. Either way, the woman who showed up at the farm the day after the funeral was not the woman who had stood next to my father at the graveside with her hand on his back. She came in a black Lincoln Navigator. Our father drove a Ford F-250 like every other man in the county, but the Navigator was hers, and she drove it like a flag. And she had a man with her I didn't recognize. He was thin, mid-50s, wearing a cheap blazer over a polo shirt, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm. Loreen introduced him to my father in the kitchen as Mr. Vellner from Crestline Title and Estates, and she said he was just here to help us get everything organized so we could move forward as a family. My father, who had been drinking again since the funeral, nodded and said that sounded reasonable. Asher and I were at the kitchen table eating cereal. I was 16 years old. My brother was 13. Loreen looked at us, and she said, "Boys, why don't you go outside and play?" We didn't play anymore. We hadn't played in years. But we went out because that was what we did when Loreen used that voice. We went, but we didn't go far. We went around the side of the house where the kitchen window was open a crack for air, and we sat down underneath it on the cold ground, and we listened. Asher was 13, but he was smart in a way that made adults uncomfortable, and he figured out a long time before I had that the only way to know what was happening in our house was to listen when we weren't supposed to be listening. So we listened. We heard Mr. Vellner explain to my father that Hollis had died intestate. That's the word he used. And it took me 20 minutes later to ask Asher what it meant, which meant that the estate would pass according to state law, which meant it would pass to my father, the only surviving son. We heard him say that the property included the 240-acre farm, the main house, the outbuildings, and any personal property contained therein. We heard him say that the workshop, in particular, contained items of potential value that should be inventoried and assessed. We heard Loreen interrupt him to say that the workshop was full of junk and old machinery, and that her brother-in-law had a salvage yard up by Cromwell that would haul most of it for free. And then we heard Loreen say something that I have never forgotten in 22 years. She said, "Garrett, honey, we need to talk about the boys. We can't keep them. Not both of them. We just don't have the room or the resources. And frankly, after what Hollis pulled with that will not being properly drawn up, we're going to need to make some hard decisions about the household. I'm sorry, but it's the truth." My father didn't say anything. He didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said, "Okay." He said okay, just like that. The man who had been our father for 16 years, who had carried us on his shoulders, who had taught me how to throw a baseball, who had sat at the back of our school plays and clapped, said okay when his wife told him she was getting rid of his sons. Asher's face, sitting there on the cold ground next to me with his back against the white siding of the house, didn't change. He had Hollis's face, my brother. He had the long jaw and the steady eyes and the absolute refusal to show anything when something hurt. He just looked at me and he said, very quietly, we should go check on the workshop. And I knew what he meant. He meant that whatever was about to happen, the workshop was the thing we still had. The workshop was the thing that mattered. We walked out across the yard, past the smokehouse, past the corn crib, past the old hand pump that hadn't worked since 1979, and we went around the back of the workshop, where the heavy oak door was. And there, fastened to the door with a brand-new hasp and padlock, was a chain, a heavy steel chain, looped through the door handle, secure with a master lock. So knew it still had the cardboard tag dangling from the shackle. Someone had been out there. Someone had locked the workshop. Someone had done it that morning, before any of us were even up, while my father was still asleep on the couch with a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the coffee table. Asher looked at the chain for a long time. Then he said, "She did that." And I said, "I know." 2 days later, Loreen sat us down in the living room, Asher and me, side by side on the same couch where our father had been sleeping, and she told us, with my father standing behind her, that we would be moving out at the end of the month. She said she had spoken to a cousin of hers in another part of the state who would take Asher in for a year or so. She said I was 16, almost an adult, and I would need to find my own arrangements. She said the farm had to be sold, the equity divided, the debt settled, and the family had to move forward, and that this was for everyone's good, including ours. My father, behind her, did not look at us. He looked at the wall. And I want to tell you, the way I tell the story now, that I stood up and said something, that I demanded justice, that I told her she couldn't do this. But I didn't. I was 16 years old, and my grandfather had just died, and my father had just folded, and I sat there on that couch, and I said nothing. Asher sat next to me, and he said nothing too, and Loreen took our silence as agreement, the way people like her always do, and she stood up, and she said, "I'm glad we're all on the same page." We were not on the same page. We were not even in the same book. But we kept that to ourselves because we had learned at 13 and at 16 that the most important thing you can do when someone is taking everything from you is to not let them see what you're still holding on to. The end of the month came faster than I expected. Loreen had set the day. She called it the transition day, the way she called everything by some smooth, professional-sounding name that disguised what was actually happening, and she had invited people to be there for it. Her own brother and sister-in-law from up in Cromwell, a cousin or two from her side, Mr. Vellner from Crestline Title and Estates, who had now become a regular fixture in our kitchen, and, for reasons I didn't understand at the time, our father's older sister, our Aunt Marlene, Hollis's daughter, who lived 3 counties over, and who had not spoken to my father in nearly a decade, but who had driven down for the funeral and had stayed in town since. Aunt Marlene was Hollis's daughter, but she was not Hollis. She was sharper, more spoken, and she had a temper that the family talked about the way they talked about bad weather. She had inherited Grandma Eulalie's directness without Grandma's warmth, and she had a long-running grudge against my father for reasons that had to do with money loaned and not repaid back when our mother first got sick. But she had loved Hollis, and she had loved Grandma Eulalie, and when she heard what was being arranged for Asher and me, she had driven down and parked herself at our kitchen table, and she had not left. I want you to understand that Aunt Marlene was not on our side. Exactly. She was on Hollis's side. She was on the side of doing things the way Hollis would have wanted them done. And she had decided, without consulting any of us, that what was happening was not that. The transition day was a Saturday in early April. The morning was clear and cold, with frost still on the grass at sunrise. The kind of morning Hollis would have been out checking fence by 6 a.m. Loreen had organized a kind of yard sale and clearing. Most of Hollis's smaller equipment was going to her brother's salvage operation, and a hay auction company from up north was sending a man to look at the larger pieces in the barn. The workshop was scheduled to be cleared by Monday. Loreen had hired a crew. Loreen had hired everyone, in fact. She had spent the last 3 weeks acting as if every decision was already made and merely needed administering. Asher and I had packed our things, 2 duffel bags each, sitting by the back door, the way Loreen had asked us to have them. My truck, a 1996 Chevy with rust along the wheel wells that I had bought myself the previous summer with money Hollis had paid me for putting up his hay, was parked out front, ready. The plan, as Loreen had explained it, was that I would drive Asher up to her cousin's house, a 5-hour drive, drop him off, and then I would be on my own. She had given me $300 in cash in a white envelope, and she said, "This should help you get started." $300 for a 16-year-old to start a life with. At 10 in the morning, Mr. Vellner arrived with a folder of paperwork. Loreen called everyone into the kitchen, my father, her brother, the sister-in-law, Aunt Marlene, Brent and Caitlin, Asher, and me. She had Mr. Vellner sit at the head of the table. She stood next to him, with her hand resting on the back of his chair, and she said she wanted to walk the family to the final arrangements so that everyone was clear on what was happening and there would be no confusion later. Mr. Vellner cleared his throat and he started to read. He read the legal description of the property. 240 acres, more or less, in Section 14, Township 6, Greene County, and he read the names of the heirs, and he read the proposed terms of the estate settlement. The farm was to be sold to a buyer Loreen had already lined up, a man named Aldous Ratcliffe who owned a beef operation up the road and who had been wanting to expand for years. The price was $540,000, which Mr. Vellner described as fair market value. The proceeds, after debts and fees, would go to my father, and through my father, into a household account that Loreen had set up the previous month. Asher and I were not mentioned, not by name, not by inheritance, not by anything. We were, in the legal language of the document, contained personal property, the same category as the tools in the workshop, the cattle in the pasture, the unused tractor parts in the barn. Loreen, when Mr. Vellner finished, said, "I think that's all very clear. Does anyone have any questions?" Aunt Marlene leaned forward in her chair. She looked at my father. She looked at Loreen. She looked at Mr. Vellner. And she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "I have one. Where exactly is the will?" There was a silence, the kind of silence where the air pressure changes. Mr. Vellner cleared his throat again. He said, as we discussed, "The decedent died intestate, and therefore the estate passes by operation of law to the surviving spouse. There is no surviving spouse, and then to the surviving children, which in this case is a decedent's son, Greene Kincaid." Aunt Marlene said, "That's interesting, because I'm also a surviving child. I'm Hollis's daughter." Loreen said, "Well, of course, but the property has been informally understood within the family." Aunt Marlene said, "Informally understood by who?" And Loreen, for the first time since Hollis had died, looked something other than confident. She looked, just for a second, like she had been caught at something, and then she recovered, and she said, "Marlene, this is not the time. We have a lot to get through today." Aunt Marlene said, "I think this is exactly the time. And I think before any of us sign anything, we need to be very clear about what's actually here and what isn't." My father, for the first time that morning, spoke. He said, "Marlene, please, just let her handle it." And my Aunt Marlene turned to my father, her brother, the man she had not really spoken to in a decade, and she said, in a voice that would have stopped a charging bull, "Garrett, you've been an embarrassment to this family for a long time, and what you're letting that woman do to those two boys is the worst thing you have done yet, and Daddy is rolling in his grave, and if you sign one piece of paper today, I will spend the rest of my life making you regret it." The kitchen went absolutely still, and in that stillness, Asher, my 13-year-old brother, who had not spoken in front of adults in 3 weeks, stood up from his chair. He walked across the kitchen. He went to the back door, where the duffel bags were. He picked up his bag, and he walked back to the table. And he sat on the floor next to his chair, and he sat back down. And he said, very quietly, "Aunt Marlene, before anybody signs anything, I think we need to open the workshop. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell, so you never miss another story like this one. We tell these long, slow stories, the kind that take their time, the kind your grandfather would have told, because we believe the people in them deserve every minute. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, and let's keep going. Because what Asher said next changed everything." Loreen said, "The workshop is locked. The workshop is not part of today's discussion. The workshop will be cleared on Monday by professionals. That is final." Asher said, "Aunt Marlene, when did Grandpa give you his old work coat?" Aunt Marlene blinked. She said, "What?" Asher said, "The brown canvas one. The one with the wool lining. The one he wore for 30 years. He gave it to you the Christmas before Grandma died. I was there. I remember." And Aunt Marlene's face changed. The hardness in her went somewhere else. And what came up underneath, it was something I had never seen on her before, which was the face of a woman who was starting to understand something she did not understand a minute ago. She said, "I have it in my car." Asher said, "Would you go get it?" "Please." Loreen said, "This is absurd. We are not stopping a legal proceeding because of a coat." Mr. Vellner, who had been silent through the whole exchange with Aunt Marlene, said something then that surprised me. He said, "Ma'am, if there's a question about the disposition of the estate, we need to address it before any documents are signed. That's not negotiable. I can't certify anything if there's an open dispute among the heirs." Loreen looked at him like he had betrayed her, which, in a sense, he had. Mr. Vellner was a paid professional, but he was a paid professional with a license he didn't want to lose, and Aunt Marlene had used the word heirs in the plural in a kitchen full of witnesses, and that meant the rules had changed. Aunt Marlene went out to her car. She came back 2 minutes later with a brown canvas work coat over her arm, the wool lining showing where the hem had worn through at the back. She set it on the kitchen table. Asher stood up again. He walked over to the coat. He turned it over so the lining was facing up, and he ran his fingers along the inside of the right pocket, the one that sits over the hip, where a man would rest his hand when he was tired. He felt along the seam. He felt along the seam a second time, and then he stopped, and his face did something I had not seen it do since our grandfather's funeral. He said, "Can someone give me a pair of scissors?" Aunt Marlene got the scissors out of the kitchen drawer. She handed them to him, and Asher, my 13-year-old brother, very carefully cut a 1-inch slit along the inside seam of the lining of our grandfather's old work coat. He reached 2 fingers into the slit, and he pulled out a small brass key. He held it up. The key was about 1 inch long, with a flat round head and a number stamped into it, 1968, the year Hollis had built the workshop. Asher said, "Grandpa told me one time that the most important thing in the workshop was the thing you'd walk right past and never see." And then he told me something else. He said, "If anything ever happens to me, the key is in the coat." He said, he told me that when I was 11. He told me on the day we put the new roof on the smokehouse. He said it once, and he never said it again, and I was 11, so I didn't know what to do with it. So I just remembered it. My brother, Asher Kincaid, 13 years old, standing in our kitchen holding a brass key that our grandfather had hidden inside a coat he gave his daughter 4 years before he died. Loreen said, "This proves nothing." Aunt Marlene said, "Garrett, get up. We are going out to the workshop." My father said, "Marlene." Aunt Marlene said, "Garrett, I am your older sister, and I am telling you to get up." My father got up. All of us, my father, Aunt Marlene, Mr. Vellner, Loreen, her brother and sister-in-law, Brent and Caitlin, Asher and me, walked out of the kitchen, across the yard, past the smokehouse, past the corn crib, past the old hand pump, to the back of the workshop. The padlock and chain Loreen had installed 3 weeks earlier were still there, gleaming and new on the weathered oak door. Loreen said, "You don't even have the key to the chain." Aunt Marlene said, "Garrett's got bolt cutters in his truck." Every man in this family has had bolt cutters in his truck since 1972. Get them. My father went to his truck. He came back with a pair of red-handled bolt cutters. He cut the chain. Loreen was making a sound now that wasn't quite a word, a kind of pressured exhale, and her brother had his hand on her arm. The chain fell off the door and hit the concrete pad with a flat metallic sound. The original brass deadbolt, Hollis's deadbolt, the one he had installed in 1968, was still there underneath. Asher held up the brass key. He stepped forward. He slid it into the deadbolt. He turned it. It turned smoothly, the way a lock turns when it's been kept oiled for 50 years. The door opened. The smell that came out of the workshop was the smell of my entire childhood. Machine oil, sawdust, the faint sourness of an old coffee pot that hadn't been emptied in a while, and the dry, papery scent of the kerosene heater Hollis ran in the winters. The light from the open door fell across the concrete floor and caught the dust in the air. The lathe was where it had always been. The welder, the workbench, everything was exactly the way Hollis had left it the morning he died. Aunt Marlene walked in first. The rest of us followed. Loreen, after a long pause, came in last. Asher walked straight to the back of the workshop, past the lathe, past the press, to the corner where the floor safe was set into the concrete. He knelt down. He pushed aside the heavy rubber mat that covered the safe. Grandpa had always kept it covered, said dust got into the mechanism otherwise, and he put his hand on the dial. And here is where I want you to slow down, because this is a part of the story that I have replayed in my mind every week for 22 years. Asher said, "Grandpa told me the combination once. He said it like a poem, so I'd remember it. He said it was the year his daddy bought this land. That's the first number. The year Grandma was born, that's the second. And the year I was born, that's the third." He said, "That way it's the 3 things that made the place what it is." I had not known that. Asher had never told me. Hollis had told my brother, my 13-year-old brother, the combination to the floor safe in his workshop, and had never told me, and had never told my father, and had never told anyone else, and had told Asher to remember it like a poem. Asher turned the dial. Right, then left, then right. He pulled the handle. The safe opened. What was inside the safe was not gold. It was not cash. It was not jewelry or coins or any of the things that people imagine when they imagine a hidden farm safe. It was paper. A thick stack of paper, banded with rubber bands, organized into folders, the way Hollis organized everything. And on top of the paper, sitting flat, was the small green leather ledger I had seen Hollis writing in for the last 3 years of his life. The one he had told me once was for later. The long story of what's true. Asher lifted the ledger out. He stood up. He walked to the workbench, and he set the ledger down under the bare light bulb that hung above the bench. And he said, "Aunt Marlene, would you read this? I think you should be the one." Aunt Marlene picked up the ledger. She opened it. Her hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. The first page in Hollis's handwriting, that careful, slanted, all capitals handwriting I would have known anywhere, said this. T.O.B. read aloud in the presence of my grandsons, Wesley and Asher Kincaid, and any other family members who happened to be present, in the event of my death. Signed, Hollis H. Kincaid. Underneath that, dated and witnessed by 2 signatures I did not at first recognize, was a notarized statement. It was a statement of intent and a record of facts, and what it laid out page by page was a story of what Hollis Kincaid had actually done with his land, a story that had nothing to do with the version of events Mr. Vellner had been reading from in the kitchen. In 1991, Hollis had executed a deed of conveyance, properly recorded at the Greene County Deed Office, transferring 240 acres of farmland into a revocable living trust. The trust was called the Kincaid Family Stewardship Trust. The trustee, originally, had been Hollis himself. The successor trustee, named in the document, was his daughter Marlene Kincaid Boggs. The beneficiaries, and this is where the air went out of the kitchen all over again, even out there in the workshop, the beneficiaries, named specifically and exclusively, were Hollis's 2 grandsons, Wesley Hollis Kincaid and Asher Garrett Kincaid. Not my father, not my stepmother, not Brent or Caitlin, or anyone else. Asher and me. Hollis had put the entire farm into a trust for us by name in 1991, when I was 4 years old and my brother was a year old. Aunt Marlene's voice, reading, started to thicken. She kept going. The ledger contained, page after page, the documentation. The original recorded deed with a Greene County clerk's stamp. The trust instrument, signed and notarized. The annual property tax records, all paid out of trust account at a small bank in the county seat, all in the name of the trust, not in Hollis's personal name and not in my father's name. The lease agreement between the trust and Hollis. Hollis had been leasing the farm from the trust for 25 years, paying himself a token rent of $1 a year, while the underlying ownership remained with the trust, which meant the underlying ownership belonged at law to Asher and me. Mr. Vellner was reading over Aunt Marlene's shoulder by this point. His face had gone the color of old parchment. He said very quietly, This is recorded. This is on file. This would have come up in any title search. Aunt Marlene said, "Was a title search done?" Mr. Vellner did not answer. Loreen was standing very still by the door of the workshop, her hand on the frame, her face stripped of every expression she usually wore. There was more. There was always more with Hollis. The next section of the ledger contained a copy of a mineral rights lease. Hollis had never told anyone about this either. That it signed with Regional Natural Gas Company in 2004, granting them subsurface drilling rights on the back 40 acres in exchange for a monthly royalty payment that had been deposited every month for 13 years into a separate trust account in Asher's and my names. The total balance of that account, as of the last statement included in the ledger, was $187,462. There was a life insurance policy, paid up in full, naming the trust as the beneficiary, in the amount of $250,000. The policy had been issued in 1989 by a small company out of Springfield that had since been absorbed by a regional carrier, and the premiums, a modest annual amount paid faithfully every January, had been drawn from the same trust account that paid the property taxes. Hollis had never let it lapse. Not once. Not in the year my mother got sick. Not in the lean year of the 2008 commodity collapse. Not in any year. The policy, when Geneva Holcomb eventually ran it down, was found to be exactly what the ledger said it was, and was payable to the trust within 90 days of the submission of a death certificate. There was, in addition, a recorded easement granting the trust perpetual access across a neighboring quarter section to reach a small spring-fed pond at the back of the property. Hollis had negotiated that easement in 1996 with the previous owner of the adjoining parcel, a man long since dead, and had recorded it properly at the courthouse, which meant it had bound every subsequent owner of that adjoining parcel ever since, whether they had been told about it or not. The easement was not financially significant, but it was a window all by itself into how Hollis had thought about the long term. He had assumed that everyone who could possibly cause his grandson's trouble would, eventually, try to, and so he had methodically, over 30 years, made sure that every claim, every right, every protection that could be locked in by paper had been locked in by paper and recorded in a public office and kept current. And there was a final document, a handwritten letter from Hollis, dated 3 weeks before he died, addressed to my brother and me by name. It said, "Boys, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and it means somebody in the family has tried to take from you what was yours all along. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I wanted to. Your grandma told me not to. She said boys with money in their pocket and a place to land lose their hunger, and the world will eat a hungry boy faster than a fed one. So I did it her way. I let you grow up working. I let you grow up not knowing. But I always knew, and the land always knew, and the paper always knew. And now you know. Take care of each other. Take care of the land. And don't let anybody tell you you're not where you belong." Aunt Marlene finished reading the letter. She put the ledger down very carefully on the workbench. And then my Aunt Marlene, who I've been afraid of my entire life, put both her hands flat on the workbench and lowered her head and cried. Silently, the way Kincaids cry, for a full minute, in the workshop her father had built the year her brother was born. Mr. Vellner cleared his throat. He said, "Ma'am, this completely supersedes any intestate proceeding. The property never belonged to Mr. Garrett Kincaid. It has belonged in trust to his sons since 1991. Any sale that was contemplated this morning is null and void. I am very sorry. I should have run the title search myself before I prepared those documents. That was a failure on my part." Loreen said this is a forgery. Aunt Marlene, without lifting her head, said, "Loreen, the deed is recorded in the county courthouse. Anybody can walk in and pull it. It has been there for 33 years. It is not a forgery. You just didn't bother to check." And then Aunt Marlene lifted her head, and she looked at my father, and she said, "Garrett, did you know?" My father said, "No." Aunt Marlene said, "Are you lying to me?" And my father, who had not been able to look at his sons or his sister for the better part of an hour, said, "I knew about the trust. I didn't know about the gas lease. I didn't know about the insurance. I knew about the trust because Daddy told me when he set it up. He told me he was doing it because he didn't trust me to do right by my own boys after their mother passed. He said it was insurance against me. And I have lived with that for over 25 years. And when Loreen started talking about selling, I told myself maybe Daddy had changed his mind. Maybe he had unwound it. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Because if I admitted what he had done, it would mean admitting that he was right about me. And I couldn't do that. My father, in the workshop his father had built, said that to his sister in front of his sons, his wife, and a stranger from a title company, and his brother and sister-in-law, and his stepchildren, all of whom were standing inside that workshop in absolute silence. And Aunt Marlene said, "Garrett, he was right about you, and he loved you anyway. And the only thing he asked of you in return was that you not let his grandsons get pushed out of their own home. And you couldn't even do that." My father did not answer. He turned around. He walked out of the workshop. He walked across the yard. He got in his truck. He drove away. We did not see him for 3 days. Loreen, with my father gone, did what people like Loreen always do when the ground gives way underneath them. She tried to rearrange it. She said, "This changes nothing about what's best for the boys. They are still minors. Wesley is 16. Asher is 13. They cannot manage a farm. The trust will need to be administered by an adult. As their stepmother, I am the natural Aunt Marlene said, Loreen. Loreen kept going. She said, and I want to recognize that there are issues that need to be worked through, but for the boys' sake, we should keep this within the immediate household, and I have a fiduciary. Aunt Marlene said, Loreen. Loreen stopped. Aunt Marlene said, the trust instrument names me as the successor trustee. It has named me as the successor trustee since 1991. You are not the immediate household. You are the woman my brother married 12 years ago. And you're also, I am increasingly certain, the woman who was about to defraud 2 children out of property worth somewhere north of $1 million. So I'm going to ask you, only one time, to leave this workshop and to leave this farm and to not come back until you have a lawyer of your own, because mine is going to be calling yours within the week. Loreen's brother said, Marlene, hold on. We're family here. Aunt Marlene looked at him. She said, you and I are not family. I have met you twice. The second time was today. Get off this property. He got off the property. He got off the property faster than I have ever seen a man get off a property. Loreen, after a long, terrible pause, followed him. Brent and Caitlin trailed after their mother. The Lincoln Navigator pulled out of the driveway, sending up a slow plume of red dust, and disappeared down the county road. Mr. Vellner stayed. He stayed because he understood, I think, that he was on the wrong side of the line, and that the only way to get back across it was to be useful. He sat with Aunt Marlene at the kitchen table for the next 4 hours, going through every single document in the Greene ledger, page by page, while my brother and I sat on the porch and didn't speak because there was nothing to say yet. Around 5 in the afternoon, Aunt Marlene came out onto the porch. She sat down on the step between Asher and me. She put one arm around my shoulders and one arm around my brother's, and she said, your grandfather loved you boys more than anything in this world. I know I'm not him, but I am his daughter, and I am going to do this the way he would have done it. Is that all right with the two of you? Asher nodded. I said, yes, ma'am, and then I said something I had not allowed myself to say for 3 weeks. I said, what's going to happen to my dad? Aunt Marlene was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I don't know, honey, I don't know. He's a grown man, and he made a grown man's choices. But he's still my brother, and he's still your father. We'll see. My father came back on the 3rd day. He drove up the gravel road around 6 in the evening, parked his truck out by the hay barn, and walked up to the house with his hat in his hand. He had not been drinking. I knew the look of him not drinking, and this was it. He had been somewhere alone, sleeping rough probably, in a county he didn't know. And whatever had happened to him in those 3 days had changed him in some way I could not read yet. He came up onto the porch where Aunt Marlene and Asher and I were sitting. We had been mostly sitting on that porch for 3 days, the way you do when something big has happened and you're waiting to find out what comes next. And he stood there for a long moment, his hat turning in his hands. And then he sat down on the porch step with his back to us, and he started to talk. He said he had driven down to the cemetery the first night and slept in his truck next to his father's grave. He said he had spent the 2nd day driving the back roads of 3 counties, trying to figure out how he was going to live with himself. He said he had spent the 2nd night at a motel he did not remember the name of, sitting on the bed, looking at his hands. He said, I have been a coward since your mother died. I have been a coward for 16 years. I let her die, and I never stopped feeling guilty about not being a better husband to her. And the only way I could keep living was to find somebody who didn't ask anything from me. And Loreen never asked anything from me except what I was already willing to give up, which was you boys. And I told myself it was for the family. And it wasn't. It was because I was a coward. He said, I am not asking you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. I am asking only that you let me try to do something useful with whatever time I have left. I will sign whatever needs signing. I will leave if you want me to leave. But I would like, before I do anything else, to apologize to you both, to my face, while you can see me. He turned around then. He looked at us, his sons, sitting on the porch in the long April light, and he said, Wesley, Asher, I am sorry. I am sorry for what I let happen to you. I am sorry I sat in that kitchen and said, okay. I am sorry I have been your father in name only for years. I am so sorry, boys. I am so sorry. And he started to cry, not the controlled, dignified Kincaid crying of his sister 3 days earlier. He cried the way a man cries who has finally stopped lying to himself. He cried sitting on his own porch in the house his father built, with his sister and his sons watching, and none of us moved and none of us spoke for a long time. Eventually, Asher got up. He walked over to where my father was sitting, and my 13-year-old brother put his hand on the back of my father's neck, the way Hollis used to do when one of us was hurt or scared, and he held it there. He didn't say anything. He just held his hand there. And after a minute, my father reached up and put his own hand over Asher's hand, and the two of them sat like that until the sun went down behind the back pasture. That is not the end of the story. That is not even close to the end. But it is the moment in the story where the worst part stopped, and where, for the first time since Hollis died, the air on that porch felt like air a person could breathe. The lawyering took the better part of a year. Aunt Marlene hired a serious estate attorney out of the city, a woman named Geneva Holcomb who had grown up in farm country and who understood that a family in collapse needs to be guided rather than build. Geneva walked the trust through every challenge Loreen's eventual lawyer attempted to mount, and by the following March, every challenge had been dismissed and the Kincaid Family Stewardship Trust was fully reconstituted in Aunt Marlene's name as trustee, with Asher and me as the named beneficiaries, exactly as Hollis had intended. Loreen filed for divorce from my father the second week of May. He did not contest it. The settlement was simple, because there was almost nothing to settle. The house on Clover Street that they'd been living in had been a rental all along. The joint accounts were nearly empty, and the only real asset she had been counting on, the farm, had never belonged to either of them. She moved out of state within 6 months. We have not heard from her since. Brent and Caitlin, who had been collateral in all of this and not really actors, drifted out of our lives the way step-siblings do when the parental connection ends. I hope they're all right. I really do. I don't blame them for what their mother tried to do. They were children too. My father did not move back to the farm right away. He asked Aunt Marlene if there was a small place on the property where he could stay while he tried to put himself back together, and Aunt Marlene, who had every right to say no, and who I half expected to say no, said yes. She said, "There's the old tenant cabin at the edge of the timber stand. It's got a roof and a stove. It needs work. If you fix it up yourself, you can stay there as long as you're staying sober and as long as the boys agree." The boys agreed. He fixed up the tenant cabin. He stayed sober. He has stayed sober for 22 years. Aunt Marlene sat down with Asher and me. I was still 16. My brother was still 13. And she said, "Your grandfather did not want to run this farm for you forever. He wanted me to hold it for you until you were old enough to run it yourselves. He wanted you raised on it. He wanted you to learn it. The trust pays the property taxes. The gas royalties pay for your education. The insurance pays for any emergency. There's enough cushion that nobody is going to lose this place over a bad year. But the place still has to be worked. You boys are going to have to grow into that. So the question is, do you want to?" We did. We did want to. We had wanted to since we were old enough to know what wanting meant. We just had not, until that moment, ever been allowed to say it. And Marlene set the terms. The terms were Hollis's terms, really, just put into modern words. The land was not to be sold. Not in part. Not in whole. Not for any reason that did not involve catastrophic medical need or the survival of the family. The hardwood timber along the creek was not to be cut. The mineral rights royalty would continue to accumulate in trust until each of us turned 25, at which point it would be available, in part, for whatever each of us needed to set ourselves up: a house, a tractor, a college degree, a business start. Until then, we lived simply, the way Hollis had lived simply, and we worked. And we did. I finished high school. Asher finished high school. I went to the State Agricultural College and got a 2-year associate's degree in farm management. Asher went to the same college 3 years later and got a 4-year degree in agricultural engineering. We came home, both of us, and we picked up where Hollis had left off. The cattle on the back pasture, the soybeans on the bottoms, the corn on the high ground, the hardwood stand left standing along the creek. My father, slowly, was allowed back into the work. First, he just helped with maintenance. Then he started helping with the cattle. By the time I was 20, he was running the cattle operation again, the way he had once helped Hollis run it before our mother got sick. He never pushed for more than he was offered. He never asked about the trust or the money or the rights. He just worked. And somewhere along the way, I don't know exactly when, Asher and I stopped thinking of him as the man who had let it happen and started thinking of him as a man who had spent 15 years working to undo it. He is not the father Hollis was. He never will be. But he is our father, and he is here, and he chose us in the end. And that has to count for something. Aunt Marlene stayed on as trustee for 9 years. When Asher turned 22, old enough in her judgment to start carrying his share, she stepped down, and we took over the trust ourselves. She still comes for Sunday dinner once a month. She still tells my father he is an embarrassment. But she says it now with the affection of a sister who has gotten her brother back. She tells me I am stubborn like her father. She tells Asher he is smart like his grandmother. She is 71 years old, and she will outlive all of us. The workshop is still standing. We have not changed it. The lathe is where Hollis left it. The welder, the workbench, the kerosene heater. We use the workshop the way he used the workshop, which is for the work that needs doing on a farm, and we keep the floor swept and the door oiled and the deadbolt working, because that's what you do when something has been entrusted to you. The brass key, the one Asher pulled out of the lining of Hollis's old work coat, sits in a small wooden box on the mantel of the main house, next to a framed photograph of Hollis and Eulalie standing on the porch in 1969. Asher and I both know where it is. Either of us can use it any time. We almost never need to. The lock has been opened. The thing it was guarding has been let out into the world. The key is now mostly a reminder. The green leather ledger, the long story of what's true, sits on the desk in the small office off the kitchen. I take it down once a year, every March, on the anniversary of Hollis's death. And I read the letter at the back. Boys, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and it means somebody in the family has tried to take from you what was yours all along. I read it slowly. I read it out loud. The first year, I read it alone. Every year since, Asher has been there, and now Asher's wife Reba, and now their 2 daughters, Hollis's great-granddaughters, Eleanor, who is 6, and Maddox, who is 3. They sit at the kitchen table, and they listen. They are too young to fully understand. They will understand in time. That is how this is supposed to work. That is how Hollis intended it. I have a wife of my own now. Her name is Tessa. We have a son, Hollis Kincaid, named for both of his grandfathers. Yes, both of them, including the one who failed for a while. Tessa understood this when she married me. She said, "Your father is a man who came back. That counts." We named our boy for both of them because Tessa is right. The farm is 240 acres. The same 240 acres my great-grandfather bought, my grandfather kept, my brother and I now hold. The hardwood stand along the creek has not been cut. The cattle still run on the back pasture. The gas royalty still arrives every month, smaller than it used to be. The well is past its peak, but steady. The way a thing Hollis set up tends to be steady. We have added a small dairy operation, something Asher pushed for. We have added 2 greenhouses, something my wife pushed for. We have not added pavement or subdivisions or anything else that would not still recognize the place if Hollis were standing on the porch looking at it. My father lives in the main house now. He moved back in 8 years ago when his health started to slip and the tenant cabin became too far for him to walk in winter. He sleeps in the room he slept in as a boy. Aunt Marlene stayed in the room she slept in as a girl whenever she comes for Sunday dinner. The bedrooms are mostly the way Hollis and Eulalie left them. The kitchen table is the same kitchen table. The chairs are the same chairs. The salt and pepper shakers in the middle of the table are the ones Eulalie bought at a county fair in 1973. Last spring, Asher and I and our father took my son Hollis out to the back pasture for the first time. He was 4. We walked the fence line. My brother on one side of him, my father on the other side, me bringing up the rear, and we stopped at the gate that opens onto the bottom field. And we lifted my son up so he could see across to where the creek runs, and we showed him the hardwood stand on the far side. And my father said, "Your great-grandfather planted some of those trees with his own hands. Your name is Hollis after him. He was the best man I ever knew, and the only thing he ever wanted was for the boys in his family to have somewhere to belong." My son said, "This is where I belong?" My father said, "Son, this is where you belong." That is the story. That is the whole story. The boys who were going to be thrown out at 16 and 13 kept the farm. The stepmother who was going to take everything. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.